this screencast, we're going to take a couple of minutes to go over some of the more important slides from the first lecture. What we covered in lecture 1 was looking at the context of personnel selection and development within organisations, ensuring you understood the main stages of the selection process, and we did talk about how they may be used for promotion, although we also focus more on the selection aspect of those, but that is something to keep uppermost in your mind. We looked at some different recruitment strategies, which we'll come back to in future weeks, and also different selection methods, which again we will come back to. We talked briefly about the need to evaluate the effectiveness of selection processes. If we look at the selection process, we'll see that this is the final stage of it. So we start by defining requirements, something we'll do in lecture 3, looking at job analysis. We then go on to actually recruit, attracting suitable candidates. We assess those candidates to see who will be most effective at a particular role, negotiate terms and conditions with them, and induct them into the organisation. The evaluation element is the last stage of the process where we look at the effectiveness of the selection procedure, and it's the element that's most often missed out of the selection process. In this module, we will look at this in relation to return on investment so that you understand the ways in which you can sell occupational psychology to companies and show them the value, both financial and in terms of attracting and recruiting a diverse range of people and the best people for the jobs. At each stage of the recruitment process, we need to evaluate what is being done against some very definite criteria. And these are reliability and validity, what we're doing, fairness, legality, generality, cost, practicality, professional image, and candidate reaction. We'll go into these in more depth within each week, but I want you to begin to think about these as mechanisms or criteria by which you will judge every stage of the assessment process, and something that should be really intrinsic to how you view recruitment selection and development. When we're talking about reliability, what we mean is whether if we perform the same test over time, the same output would be realised. So does the instrument measure consistently over time? And there are various ways of doing this. We can look at test reliability to consider whether a test is stable over time. We can look at whether it compares effectively with similar tests in parallel forms. We can use statistical mechanisms such as complex alpha to look at the internal reliability of that specific test. And we can look at the inter-rater reliability, i.e. whether there's agreement between two raters if they're using the same instrument to assess the same person. Would they come up with the same answer? Moving on to consider the other very important criteria for judgment, validity. So we can break this down to various different ways. Base validity is whether the test seems to measure what it's intended to measure. Would people believe that that is the way in which it works? And this is whether it's tied with the idea of candidate acceptability. Would people generally accept that this test was doing what we thought it would be? Content validity, does the test look plausible to experts? Does it set out to test what it says it's going to test? When we come on to criterion validity, we're then looking at using statistical mechanisms to establish whether the test relates to performance. So either whether the test relates to current performance, so if you provide a test of an individual, will it differentiate between those people who are performing better to those that are performing less well? Or predictability in the future, would it predict who is going to be a better performer in the longer term? And we have very specific guidelines around the level of correlation that we're looking for validity. In an ideal world, we'd want a correlation of greater than 0.5 between our test and performance, although it is very rare to have that level. It's quite acceptable to have a correlation of above 0.3, and so that would be something we would be striving for. But there are other measures of validity as well. Construct validity refers test of the ability of a measurement tool to actually measure a psychological concept, to measure what it says, it says it's going to measure. Convergent validity tests whether the constructs that should be related are related. So we might look at two different tests that measure the same thing, so perhaps tests of numerical ability. You would expect that somebody performing high in one test of numerical ability would also perform higher in another test of numerical ability. We would also be looking at divergent validity, i.e. that the test is only measuring the specific concept that you want it to measure. It's not measuring different constructs. So if you have a test which is looking at persuasive ability, that isn't crossing a separate construct which is looking at general interpersonal communication skills. So the test only measures the thing that you want it to measure. Validity is where you use a whole range of tests in combination to produce a compound validity. So we would look at different behaviours. So we would look at things like, well, in this example, numerical ability, verbal ability, and personality measures. We would put them all together to say that all of those things in combination would provide an ideal personnel graduate. And we would look at using those tests in combinations in that way. There's a basic assumption of synthetic validity that different jobs involving the same kinds of behaviours also require the same knowledge, skills, ability, and other characteristics. So that if you're using a test for one job, it should also be applicable for another job if that job requires the same element. Unfortunately, validity isn't tested that often. Validation studies are rare, and we have problems with them as well, often because they're quite small scale and they're restricted in range. Meta-analysis can help deal with some of these problems where you put all of a range of different studies together and average across those. So we have got specific statistical techniques which will allow that to happen, so that we can basically pool all of the tests and act as if we have larger sample sizes, and that can correct sampling error and range restriction and some of those types of problems. When we use meta-analysis, we can see that criterion validity is often greater than individual studies show that to be. And I'd encourage you to have a look at a couple of meta-analyses of such as I can